Hello, this is Mr. Radish, and today we're going to be talking about the study of life, which is biology. Bio means life, and logy is the study of, so biology really means the study of life. The characteristics that we're going to be talking about, all living things have these characteristics. The first one we want to look at is that it responds to the environment. So when we look at responding to the environment, a good example is this picture of this person having goosebumps. Goosebumps is a response to either being cold or excited, where we have the fight or flight response. It's where we used to have lots of hair on our body, which we don't anymore. So the goosebumps is where the hair will stand on end. So it responds to the environment. The next thing we want to talk about is that it grows and develops. So whenever we look at this picture about how a man will go through his life cycle, women go through that too. They start out as an infant, then they grow to a child, and then it's a young adult, and then we go to the cane. It's a natural progression that all living things go through. We grow and develop. And then it produces offspring. I thought this was a really cool picture that all living things produce offspring. This turtle has a bunch of little baby turtles hanging around. These are actually an endangered species. So you can see that this is an important thing that we do, is that we reintroduce species that we've destroyed or pushed out with habitat destruction. But all living things grow and develop. All living things respond to the environment. All living things produce offspring. The next thing we want to talk about is that it maintains homeostasis. That is a huge word, so I'm going to leave the picture to the side. And it shows this, well, this is actually a representation of me in the summertime. Whenever you live in the South, it's like this. Anytime it gets to be about June, you just, And what it is, homeostasis is it wants to stay even. So this guy is sweating, he's got his tongue hanging out, he's wearing shorts, he's trying to maintain his body at a normal temperature, which is 98.6. So whenever it gets warmer outside, the body turns these mechanisms on so that we can maintain a normal body temperature. All living things have a complex chemistry, which means we're made of molecules, and all these molecules respond or react with each other. It makes a complex chemistry. And the next one is that things all have cells. So whenever we look at cells, you can see how complicated they are. We're going to be talking about this, and you're going to be able to understand what all of these little organelles are inside here, the nucleus, the nucleolus, the mitochondria. We're going to be able to describe this by the time the year is over, how the functions of all of these things react with each other. One of the things that, excuse me, about biology, the next topic is the study of biology has unifying principles inside. And the first one we want to talk about is cell theory. Cell theory means that all living things are made of cells. We've already talked about the cell. You saw a picture of the cell, and that this is how life began. It began as a single living cell, and everything starts as a single living cell. You started as a single living cell, and even the single-celled organisms. So we can see how living things are a single cell, and that's the cell theory. Next one is gene theory. The genes are stored in your DNA. This is a relatively new theory because we didn't know that genes were there. We're looking at maybe the early 1900s when we were talking about genes. The genes are made of DNA, which is stored in your nucleus. The DNA contains chromosomes, which has the instructions on making proteins. This is, again, something that we're going to be learning in another chapter. The next one we want to talk about is homeostasis. We touched on homeostasis just a little bit. Homeostasis is where we attempt to keep things in balance. And then the last one, but not least, is evolution. Whenever we talk about evolution, evolution is a system that shows how life has changed over time. That is the definition of evolution. It's not something to cause confusion among organizations or people. Evolution is simply defined as change over time. And something that I want to show you about this picture is that it branches. It doesn't have a direct line. If it was a direct line, that means that the person or the organism behind you is extinct. But you'll notice that it's not that case. It's a branching thing. It's something that we come from common ancestors. Interdependence of living things is the next topic. And when we talk about how living things coexist, here's one that coexists. This is symbiosis. Symbiosis is where two organisms live together in harmony, which would naturally be food for each other or one or the other. Nemo is one of the defining things in your generation. Everybody likes Finding Nemo. He lives in a sea anemone. Sea anemones love to eat other fish. Clownfish use this symbiotic relationship to hide from predators, and they also clean the anemones. So symbiosis is where two organisms will coexist together. The next thing that the interdependent of living things, is how organisms compete for resources. They compete for space. They compete for mates so that they can reproduce. So here's two pictures of two sheep butting heads to see who gets to reproduce with the female. The most fit is going to be able to survive, which is a tenet of evolution, the survival of the fittest. So competition is something that all organisms do. So the next thing we want to talk about is the interdependence of living things, such as the levels of organisms. Whenever we talk about the levels of organisms, the one thing that we want to be aware of is that each one of these levels that we're going to address has its own branch of scientists studying it, such as cellular scientists. So the first level, the smallest thing that you could be and still be a living thing, is a cell. So it all begins with a cell. The next thing we want to talk about is that a group of cells is called a tissue. A group of tissues working together is called an organ. A group of organs working together is an organ system. A group of organ systems working together is what you are, which is an organism. A bunch of organisms living in the same place is a population. A group of populations of different organisms living together is a community. A group of communities working together is an ecosystem, which is a fairly large mechanism. And then a group of ecosystems working together is a biome, which we'll learn about all the biomes in a later chapter. And then all the biomes working together is what I like to address as the living earth. It's all the biomes working together in the earth. The next thing that we want to talk about is the diversity of life. Diversity of life is broken up into 6 kingdoms. These 6 kingdoms, some books will address them as 5, but there really are 6, the new way of looking at it. And the first one is Archaeobacteria. And when you look at this picture, you can see some of these things, how life has become more complex as the world has changed. Archaeobacteria was one of the first, it is the first living thing on the earth that we've seen so far. It changed our atmosphere. They used to consume sulfur and methane. The next one up was bacteria, where they used oxygen to metabolize. These are organisms, Archaeobacteria, and bacteria do not have a nucleus. The next one up is a protist, which developed a nucleus. It's single-celled organisms. So we have Archaeobacteria so far, bacteria, then protist, then fungus, which is mushrooms. Then we also have plants and animals. So these are the 6 kingdoms: Archaeobacteria, Eubacteria, protist, fungus, plants, and animals. The last thing that we want to talk about in this chapter is evolution of life. It hasn't been that long ago that this man steps up and he says that things maybe were here on the earth longer than we believed. And that as time went on, that species changed along with the time. So he wrote a book called Origin of Species. He talked about how species would have similar structures. And at this time, he didn't have any proof of chromosomes or DNA mutation. But as you can see here, this is some of the evidence that we were talking about in biology. All of these is human, dog, bird, and whale. All have the same bones. They're colored. The bones are colored the same, and you can see that they're just because they're shaped different, but we still have the same bones. This is something that Darwin studied. Then we want to talk about the evolution theory after Darwin. We're going to deal more with this in chapter 9 and 10. But evolution after Darwin, we found numerous fossils to support his claims. We now know that DNA, how it works and how mutations work. We also know that DNA shows how we have common ancestors, such as an example is that 98% of all of our chromosomes we share with chimpanzees. The last thing we want to talk about in the chapter is of misconceptions about evolution. A lot of times we have discussions about how evolution really works, and well, some of it just isn't true, such as some argue how the earth first began. Well, evidence and the scientific method has shown that evolution explains how life changes over time. It doesn't mean that it just magically appeared, so we have to look at those things. Another one is that some argue that humans evolved from modern apes. Instead, evolution explains how we share a common ancestor. So all of these things we're going to study this year. It's going to be an exciting year. I hope this laid a foundation of how we're going to start and begin. So this is how biology will be this year. Thank you very much.